The gray swells of the Caribbean roll on, indifferent to the sudden fracture in hemispheric power. On the night of January 3, 2026, the quiet darkness over Caracas shattered with explosions that lit the sky above Fort Tiuna, Venezuela's sprawling military headquarters, and other sites across the capital. Air defenses were suppressed in a coordinated barrage as U.S. forces executed Operation Absolute Resolve, a meticulously planned raid involving more than 150 aircraft launched from bases throughout the Western Hemisphere. Special operations teams descended by helicopter into the fortified grounds, overcoming resistance in a swift, overwhelming assault. Nicolás Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, were seized from their residence, blindfolded, fitted with soundproof headphones, and extracted without American casualties. Those 7 U.S. service members sustained minor injuries, most recovering rapidly. The couple was initially flown to the USS Iwo Jima offshore before transfer to New York. President Donald Trump announced the capture that same day from Mar-a-Lago, declaring the United States would run Venezuela until a safe, proper, and judicious transition could occur. He framed the action as a law enforcement operation supported by military force, targeting long-standing federal indictments for drug trafficking and weapons charges against Maduro, whom the administration had designated as leader of the Cartel de los Soles, labeled a foreign terrorist organization. Trump posted images on Truth Social, Maduro aboard the warship, then perp walk through DEA hallways in New York, escorted in a convoy to the Metropolitan Detention Center in Brooklyn under heavy security. In the immediate aftermath, a tense, almost surreal calm descended on Caracas. The capital grew unusually quiet on January 4th, with streets emptied of traffic, shops shuttered, gas stations closed, and convenience stores dark. Shoppers formed orderly lines outside a supermarket under the indifferent sun, faces etched with uncertainty as they waited for basic goods. Smoke still lingered in places from the strikes, destroyed vehicles and debris scattered at La Carlota military airbase, anti-aircraft units reduced to twisted metal. Reports varied on casualties. Venezuelan officials later claimed up to 100 dead, including a significant portion of Maduro's security contingent in cold blood, with Cuba reporting 32 of its military and intelligence personnel killed. Independent accounts noted most fatalities among Presidential Guard members, alongside a smaller number of civilians. Maduro and Flores appeared in a Manhattan federal court on January 5th, pleading not guilty through an interpreter. "I am innocent. I am not guilty. I am a decent man," Maduro stated, adding, "I am still president of my country." He and his wife faced charges related to narco-terrorism. The arraignment unfolded amid tight security, with courtroom sketches capturing the scene. The Trump administration moved decisively to extend control over Venezuelan oil infrastructure, describing it as vital for rebuilding the country and generating profit for both American and Venezuelan interests. Trump emphasized reclaiming U.S. stakes in the world's largest reserves, with plans to export up to $2 billion worth of crude to the United States, potentially diverting supplies from other buyers like China. Energy Secretary announcements followed, signaling indefinite U.S. oversight of sales. Vice President Delcy Rodriguez was sworn in as interim president on January 5th by Venezuela's National Assembly and Supreme Court, denouncing the raid as a kidnapping and foreign aggression. She called for Maduro's immediate release while assuming leadership amid the fragile transition, declaring Venezuela would never again be a colony of any empire. On the high seas, the mechanics of sanctions enforcement had already been grinding forward, now accelerated by the raid. Even before January 3rd, the U.S. had imposed a naval quarantine, officially a blockade of illicit flows, seizing vessels like the Skipper in December 2025. P-8 Poseidon aircraft patrolled relentlessly overhead, Coast Guard cutters trailed suspects across vast expanses, and deployable specialized forces prepared for tactical boardings in coordination with Department of Defense assets. Command centers maintained meticulous logs, AIS signals spoofed or darkened, hulls repainted in hasty disguises, transponders silenced to render vessels dark. Post-raid, evasion intensified. At least 16 tankers fled Venezuelan ports by January 5th, scattering in seemingly coordinated directions to overwhelm the quarantine. These shadow fleet vessels, often tied to networks involving Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, executed rapid countermeasures. Flags switched mid-voyage, names repainted on hulls in defiance of maritime norms. The formerly named Bella 1, long tracked for carrying Venezuelan crude and sanctioned for links to Iranian and Russian oil trades, had evaded an initial boarding attempt in the Caribbean in December. It then adopted the Russian flag, was renamed Marinera, and entered Russia's official maritime registry, with home port listed as Sochi or Taganrog. Fog began to cling to the North Atlantic as the Marinera pushed northeast, tracked about 300 miles south of Iceland toward the North Sea, possibly bound for an Arctic port. U.S. Coast Guard cutters, supported by Navy P-8s and other assets, maintained persistent trail despite the escalating complications of Russian registry. Reports surfaced of submarine contacts in the vicinity, a Russian submarine and naval vessels deployed to escort the aging, empty tanker, heightening the specter of pier-level escalation. The Russian Foreign Ministry monitored developments closely, lodging diplomatic notes requesting the U.S. cease pursuit and describing the actions as violations of maritime law. Far from these indifferent swells, but interconnected through the same sanctioned energy networks, Tehran confronted its own deepening crisis. Massive protests, fueled by economic collapse, soaring inflation, and a collapsing rial, filled streets and bazaars. Internet blackouts rolled nationwide. Security forces clashed with demonstrators. Dozens reported dead, including bystanders and children, with over 1,200 arrests documented. On January 9, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei addressed the nation on state television, accusing protesters of acting as mercenaries for foreigners and ruining their own streets to make the president of another country happy, a direct reference to Trump, whose hands he declared stained with the blood of Iranians. Khamenei warned of crackdowns on saboteurs and vandals, framing the unrest as terrorist actions backed by external enemies, even as unconfirmed intelligence reports circulated of a Plan B contingency for him and close associates to flee to Moscow if security fractured further. In Washington and command rooms across the U.S. Southern Command, the multipolar shadows lengthened. Seizures continued unabated. Multiple vessels boarded on January 7th, including the Marinera in the North Atlantic and others like the stateless Sophia in the Caribbean. Yet the risks mounted. Global condemnations framed the unilateral moves as imperialism. Russia decried breaches of international norms. The high seas, once a domain of assumed U.S. dominance and enforcement, now revealed contested realities: rapid reflagging, naval shadowing, diplomatic protests, regime resilience amid internal upheaval, and great power pushback that made every boarding a calculation of escalation. The standoff held, cold and mechanical, as gray swells carried the weight of contested flows. The heavier, steel-gray swells of the North Atlantic replaced the warmer Caribbean waters as the pursuit intensifies. Fog rolling in thick and low, reducing visibility to a few miles and turning every radar contact into a calculation of risk. By January 7, 2026, the tanker formerly designated Bella 1, a long-standing member of the Shadow Fleet accused of ferrying Venezuelan crude, Iranian oil, and Russian cargoes in violation of U.S. sanctions, has fully executed its defensive metamorphosis. The hull now displays a freshly painted Russian flag, the name Marinera boldly reapplied in white letters over the old markings, and the vessel has been entered into Russia's official maritime registry, with home ports listed as Sochi or Taganrog. This mid-voyage reflagging, completed after the ship evaded an initial U.S. Coast Guard boarding attempt in December near Venezuelan waters, introduces a deliberate layer of sovereign protection. Under established maritime conventions, a legitimately flagged vessel of a nuclear peer state like Russia requires far more cautious handling than a stateless or fraudulently flagged one. The Marinera, reported empty of cargo and showing signs of age in its hull plating, had been heading toward Venezuela to load sanctioned crude, but reversed into the open Atlantic following the failed interception. It maintained intermittent AIS signals, darkened transponders at key intervals, and pushed northeast, tracked roughly 300 miles south of Iceland on a course toward the North Sea and potentially an Arctic Russian port such as Murmansk. U.S. assets stay locked on. The Coast Guard cutter USCGC Monroe trails persistently, its deck crews logging every course change amid rolling swells that crash against steel. Navy P-8 Poseidon aircraft provide overhead surveillance, their sonar buoys and radar sweeps feeding real-time data back to command centers. Pursuit footage disseminated by U.S. European Command captures the scene. Helicopters hovering low over churning gray water, cutters holding station in the indifferent sea, the tanker's silhouette emerging and fading in the mist. Diplomatic friction mounts immediately. The Russian Foreign Ministry issues formal notes protesting the continued chase, characterizing it as a violation of international maritime law and demanding an end to U.S. interference. Moscow's Transport Ministry verifies the vessel's registration, emphasizing that the temporary permit to fly the Russian flag complies with both national regulations and international norms. Influential Russian voices escalate the rhetoric. Senior lawmakers denounce the pursuit as outright piracy, while the ministry maintains that contact with the Marinera was disrupted following U.S. actions. Evasion spreads beyond this single vessel. Reports confirm at least 3 additional tankers active in Venezuelan waters have adopted Russian flags in the preceding days. The Hyperion switching on January 1st, the Premier transitioning from Gambia to Russia on December 31, creating a coordinated surge of protected hulls designed to saturate enforcement resources. In parallel, U.S. forces execute another boarding in the Caribbean, the Panama-flagged Sophia, documented by PDVSA records as fully loaded with Venezuelan crude and previously known for spoofing its AIS to falsely appear off West Africa while loading near Venezuelan ports, is intercepted in international waters without resistance. Its crew, unable to complete a rapid reflagging, yields to deployable specialized forces operating under judicial warrants. U.S. Southern Command orchestrates these operations within the expanded framework of sanctions enforcement, now amplified after the January 3rd raid. The administration reaffirms indefinite oversight of Venezuelan oil flows, with Energy Department officials detailing plans to redirect up to $2 to $3 billion in crude to American markets for the dual benefit of U.S. interests and Venezuelan rebuilding under interim authority. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth posts publicly that the blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world. In Tehran, the interconnected crisis of sanctioned networks deepens amid domestic upheaval. Nationwide internet blackouts persist, severing external links as protests, driven by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and the plummeting rial, fill bazaars, streets, and campuses in at least 20 cities. Security forces engage demonstrators with live fire and mass arrests. Dozens are confirmed dead, including bystanders and children, with thousands detained. Verified footage shows burning buildings, ablaze vehicles, and crowds chanting against the regime, despite the repression. On January 9th, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei delivers a televised address, his tone unyielding. He accuses protesters of serving as mercenaries for foreigners, specifically ruining their own streets to make the president of another country happy, an explicit reference to Trump, whose hands he declares stained with the blood of Iranians. Khamenei vows the Islamic Republic will not back down, labeling demonstrators vandals and saboteurs, and signals intensified crackdowns with judiciary officials promising decisive, maximum punishment without leniency. Intelligence continues to reference an unconfirmed Plan B contingency for Khamenei and associates to escape to Moscow if the regime's security apparatus fractures. These layered countermeasures, rapid reflagging across multiple hulls, reported Russian naval escorts, including submarine and surface assets shadowing the Marinera, formal diplomatic protests, and regime defiance amid enduring internal unrest, construct a resilient web against unilateral enforcement. U.S. seizures proceed, yet the domain grows contested. Peer naval presence transforms routine interdictions into escalatory calculations, while global voices condemn the actions as overreach. The high seas and distant streets alike reveal the mechanics of multipolar contestation, cold and inexorable. The standoff extends, tension coiling tighter across fog-bound waters and blackout-shrouded cities. Deeper into the North Atlantic, the fog closes in like a shroud over waters that have turned hostile in sub-zero latitudes, where every horizon conceals the potential presence of a peer rival. As of January 7 to 9, 2026, the pursuit that began in warmer Caribbean seas has culminated in direct action. The U.S. Coast Guard, supported by naval assets including P-8 Poseidon aircraft and surveillance from Allied platforms, boards and seizes the Marinera, formerly Bella 1, in the North Atlantic, roughly between Iceland and Scotland, approximately 109 to 300 miles south of Iceland. The operation unfolds early on January 7th without reported incident or direct confrontation, despite the heightened stakes. The vessel, empty and aging, had been shadowed for over 2 weeks after evading an initial Coast Guard boarding attempt in December near Venezuelan waters. Its crew executed the reflagging mid-voyage, painting a Russian flag on the hull, renaming it Marinera, and securing entry into Russia's official maritime registry with home ports Sochi or Taganrog, while pushing northeast toward a potential Arctic Russian destination like Murmansk. U.S. European Command releases footage and statements confirming the seizure pursuant to a federal court warrant, executed by the USCGC Monroe and deployable specialized forces. The tanker is described as a Venezuelan shadow fleet vessel, linked to sanctioned oil trades involving Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, now deemed stateless despite the Russian flag due to alleged false registration tactics. Russian naval presence shadows the scene. Reports confirm a Russian submarine and surface vessels deployed to escort the Marinera in the vicinity, with Western surveillance, including U.S. P-8s from Iceland bases and RAF platforms, detecting contacts ahead of the boarding. No escalation occurs during the seizure. Contact with the vessel is lost from Moscow's perspective post-boarding, as stated by Russia's Transport Ministry. The Foreign Ministry and senior lawmakers condemn the action as a violation of maritime law and outright piracy, lodging protests and demanding humane treatment for any Russian nationals among the crew. The operation coincides with a parallel seizure in the Caribbean. The Panama-flagged Sophia, documented as fully loaded with Venezuelan crude, per PDVSA records, and previously known for AIS spoofing to mask its true position near Venezuelan ports, is boarded without resistance in international waters. U.S. Southern Command announces the interception of this stateless, sanctioned, dark fleet motor tanker, with the Coast Guard escorting it for final disposition. These back-to-back actions, announced January 7, underscore the administration's intensified enforcement, with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth declaring the blockade of sanctioned and illicit Venezuelan oil remains in full effect anywhere in the world. Internal fractures widen amid global condemnations. In Caracas, funerals take place January 7th for Venezuelan soldiers killed in the January 3rd raid, with debris still visible at sites like La Carlota Air Base. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez denounces ongoing U.S. control efforts as aggression, while the administration outlines plans for indefinite oversight of Venezuelan oil sales, aiming to redirect billions in crude to U.S. markets for rebuilding and stabilization. China, a major buyer, condemns the moves as threats to global energy security. In Tehran, the streets remain sites of enduring upheaval as protests, fueled by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and the rial's plunge, persist into January 9th, despite nationwide internet blackouts and mass arrests numbering in the thousands. Verified footage shows burning vehicles, ablaze buildings, and clashes in multiple cities, with dozens confirmed dead from security force actions. On January 9th, Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei addresses the nation on state television in a defiant speech, accusing protesters of acting as mercenaries for foreigners and ruining their own streets to make the president of another country happy, explicitly referencing Trump, whose hands he declares stained with the blood of Iranians. Khamenei vows the Islamic Republic will not back down against vandals and saboteurs, signaling escalated crackdowns with judiciary officials promising decisive, maximal punishment without leniency. Intelligence reports persist regarding a contingency Plan B for Khamenei and associates to flee to Moscow if the regime's hold fractures further. Amid recruitment of Iraqi Shia militias to bolster forces, these elements completed seizures amid reported peer naval shadowing, diplomatic condemnations framing U.S. actions as overreach, regime resilience under internal pressure, and coordinated evasion across shadow fleets, deepen the institutional dread. The unilateral tools of resource control and sanctions enforcement, once projected as dominant in the hemisphere and beyond, now encounter the cold mechanics of multipolar coordination. Rapid registry shifts, great power escorts, protest endurance, and formal pushback that transform every interdiction into an escalatory threshold. The contested domain expands, tension coiling across fog-shrouded seas, blackout-veiled streets, and command centers tracking the unresolved standoff. Across contested domains, from the fog-shrouded tracks of the North Atlantic to the blackout-veiled streets of Tehran and the command centers where unilateral assertions meet coordinated resistance, the standoff endures as of January 9, 2026, mechanical and unresolved. The seizures completed on January 7 mark a high water point in enforcement. The Marinera, formerly Bella 1, now under U.S. escort toward American shores after a weeks-long pursuit that ended without direct confrontation, despite the presence of a Russian submarine and naval vessels shadowing nearby. U.S. European command footage shows the USCGC Monroe trailing the aging, empty tanker in rolling swells between Iceland and Scotland, helicopters hovering low as deployable specialized forces execute the boarding pursuant to a federal warrant. Officials deem the vessel a Venezuelan shadow fleet, link in sanctioned trades involving Venezuela, Russia, and Iran, its Russian flag and registry, secured mid-voyage after evading an earlier Caribbean attempt, insufficient to shield it from interdiction under U.S. sanctions authority. Simultaneously, in warmer Caribbean waters, the Panama-flagged Sophia, fully loaded with approximately 2 million barrels of Venezuelan crude per PDVSA records, long notorious for AIS spoofing to mask its true position near Venezuelan ports while appearing off West Africa, yields without resistance. U.S. Southern Command announces the capture of this stateless, sanctioned dark fleet motor tanker, conducting illicit activities in international waters, with the Coast Guard escorting it for final disposition. These actions join prior seizures like the Skipper and Centuries, forming part of an intensified blockade that has seen at least 4 vessels taken in recent weeks. Russia's response remains measured but pointed. The Foreign Ministry and Transport Ministry denounced the Marinera boarding as a violation of maritime law and outright piracy, confirming loss of contact post-seizure and demanding humane treatment for any Russian nationals among the crew. Senior lawmakers escalate rhetoric, with calls for symmetrical measures to restore deterrence, yet no immediate military escalation follows. The submarine escort, deployed as the tanker pushed northeast toward the North Sea and potential Arctic ports, highlights the threshold crossed. Peer naval assets in proximity transform sanctions enforcement into a domain of calculated great power risk. In Caracas, funerals proceed for soldiers killed in the January 3rd raid on Fort Tiuna, debris lingering at sites like La Carlota Air Base. Interim President Delcy Rodriguez, sworn in January 5th, denounces ongoing U.S. control as aggression while navigating cooperation. Political prisoners released in gestures interpreted as concessions, amid Trump's announcement that Venezuela will turn over up to 50 million barrels of sanctioned oil for U.S. markets, potentially diverting supplies from China and generating billions for rebuilding under American oversight. Major oil companies pledge investments with plans to refurbish infrastructure, though experts caution years may pass before meaningful output returns. Global condemnations frame the unilateral moves as overreach, violations of sovereignty, threats to energy security, echoes of imperialism. China, a key buyer, voices concern over disrupted flows. In Tehran, the parallel theater of sanctioned networks deepens into sustained crisis. Nationwide internet blackouts persist January 9th, severing external communication as protests, sparked by economic collapse, hyperinflation, and the rial's collapse, continue in bazaars, streets, and campuses across multiple cities. Verified footage captures burning vehicles, ablaze buildings, and clashes with security forces. Dozens confirmed dead from live fire, thousands arrested. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei addresses the nation on state television in a defiant speech, accusing protesters of acting as mercenaries for foreigners and ruining their own streets to make the president of another country happy, explicitly referencing Trump, whose hands he declares stained with the blood of Iranians. Khamenei vows the Islamic Republic will not back down against vandals and saboteurs, signaling escalated crackdowns with judiciary officials promising decisive, maximal punishment without leniency. Unconfirmed intelligence references a Plan B contingency for Khamenei and associates to flee to Moscow if security fractures further, amid reports of Iraqi Shia militias recruited to bolster regime forces. These layered realities, seizures upheld amid peer shadowing, diplomatic protests, regime resilience under internal upheaval, coordinated evasion across shadow fleets, expose the limits of unilateral reach. The tools of resource control and sanctions enforcement, once projected as dominant, now encounter the inexorable mechanics of multipolar coordination. Rapid reflagging, great power naval presence, protest endurance, and formal pushback that elevate every action to an escalatory threshold. Influence is contested not by the strongest alone, but by alignments that make unilateral action riskier in real time. In multipolarity, unilateral reach is being contested, not yet defeated.